So welcome again to AWC in Conversation. My name is Joey Clark. I'm an ecologist and science communicator based in Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Gadigal country and pay tribute to all of the traditional owners and Indigenous ranger groups with whom we have the privilege to work alongside. As usual, there's a lot going on at AWC. While you've been waiting for one of the limited tables at your local cafe to become available, our team has been hard at work. So a few of the highlights from the past week: we've had some unseasonal rain in the Kimberley, and the Mornington science team has been out looking for bandicoots. At Mount Gibson, they've been doing camera trap surveys to look for stick nest rats. And it's a great story at Mount Gibson. We've noticed that things like bilbies, red-tailed phascogales, and shark-bay bandicoots are all spreading out into that fenced area. So the occupancy for those species is going up. At Karakamaya, we're using a new sort of technology to identify bats. These are little audio recorders that can detect down to species level which bats, and they've discovered a new species there that hadn't previously been recorded at Karakamaya, the southern white-striped free-tailed bat. So that's exciting from the southwest. Up on Cape York, Graham and Sal have had a lot more snakes around the operation space, 4 death adders in the last month, and a taipan just yesterday. And in breaking news, some new arrivals at Mallee Cliffs, and I can't say anything more about that, but stay tuned and hopefully you'll hear more about that tomorrow. We're trying something new today. I have 2 guests joining me. The first is Dr. John Kanowski, and John is AWC's chief scientist. So we'll talk through AWC's National Science Program. And our second guest will be Dr. Liana Joseph, and Liana is National Science Manager, who I'll introduce in a minute when we get to that part of the talk. So John, first of all, welcome to you. You're working from home in the Atherton Tablelands, and you've been doing that since before it was cool. Can you describe the part of the world that you live in and some of the animals that you see around your house?
Sure, Joey. Great to be here. Well, you can sort of see behind me that I live in a eucalypt forest on the western edge of the Atherton Tablelands. So I've done a lot of research in rainforest, and it's a fantastic place to work in, but not so great to live in my opinion. So nice and open, and there's wallabies and rufous pettongs, barking owls, little pet swamp wallaby, had a black snake on the yard yesterday. So yeah, it's in nature. It's in nature.
And you grew up in the bush, so was it a direct path into conservation for you?
No, yeah, my dad was a forester, a professional forester in Queensland, and spent a lot of time in the bush as a kid. But I sort of ran from that as a young adult, went and did an arts degree, dropped out and lived in the bush, and became active in conservation, basically as an activist. So manning the barricades, trying to actually stop things happening that we didn't think should. That ended me up in a few scrapes. But I came out of it feeling like while my heart was in the right place, I didn't actually know enough about the issues that I was concerned about. So I went back and did a conservation science degree. That ended up in a PhD on possums and tree kangaroos up here on the Atherton Tablelands, and via a long postdoc on rainforest restoration into AWC.
Right, so let's just talk a little bit about your rainforest ecology work in North Queensland. I've got some photos that you shared with me. Thank you for those. Can you describe what your PhD project was looking at? Sure.
So that in that photo there, I'm collecting rainforest leaves because I was trying to understand what controlled the distribution of Lumholtz's tree kangaroo and 4 species of rainforest possum. So the rainforests of North Queensland are basically, that's tree kangaroo poo and a scratch. That's as close as you get to them sometimes. I was basically trying to understand their ecology. And so I counted possums and tree kangaroos, and then looked at a whole lot of factors in the environment that control their distribution, one of which was leaf chemistry. I should shout out that a lot of these photos of animals are Joey's. So they're beautiful work, Joey.
And these are really special rainforest possums, and they're kind of quite restricted to high altitude rainforest, aren't they? What implications does that have for their conservation?
Yeah, that was an interesting outcome of my PhD. So green possums there. Essentially, while I found, like leaf chemistry is an important control on the abundance of possums, the higher the nutrients in the soil and the leaves, the more possums there are, but that doesn't explain why they're not in the lowlands. The lowlands are just as good chemically for the possums, and it does seem to be climate. That green possum that just showed, I've collaborated on a study where we looked at the thermal physiology of the animal, and basically it looks like that the hotter it gets, the less habitat these animals are going to have because they get forced up the hill. I'm actually in taking advantage of COVID situation to revisit some of my PhD sites to see over the 25 years since I did the surveys, what changes there's been.
Right. And then after the PhD, you did some time working on rainforest restoration. Was that also in North Queensland?
That was fantastic work. It was in North Queensland and in sort of southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales. So where there used to be major areas of rainforest in Australia. It was the sort of field work where you're never more than a quarter of an hour from a coffee shop. So very hard work. Met some great people, some of whom are AWC supporters. And we found out a lot. It was very interesting, but I felt by the end of it that it was a sort of narrow road. And a mate, a guy who works for AWC, a botanist who's got a lot of integrity, rang me up and asked me if I was interested in working for AWC, who, to be honest, I hadn't heard of at the time. But I trusted this guy, and it was a sort of, I was ready for a leap into the unknown, and so I leapt, and I'm still here, and it's been a very, very interesting journey subsequently.
Yeah, great. Just for anyone who's joined in the last few minutes, I'll just remind you that you can ask questions as we go using the Q&A button at the bottom. And for any technical support, you can use the chat function, and we've got people on the other end that can help you out if you're having trouble hearing or seeing us. So John, you've now been with AWC since 2008, and initially that role was as regional ecologist in Queensland, and that's quite a huge region, so lots of different sanctuaries. Can you describe some of that work?
Yeah, that was heaps of fun. So I came in at a time where we really just recently acquired a bunch of properties. So this photo here is the first survey we conducted of Pangolina 7 emus. So that Indigenous man there is Frank Shadforth, the owner of 7 emu. And that young looking bloke in the black hat, that's me. And Jeff Middleton is the other guy there. And we basically plotted that survey from maps and from Google Earth, and we drove places, and where we couldn't drive, we got helicopters to drop us into gorges that we want to investigate. So that is about the best sort of ecology you can do in terms of fun. From that, we then built up a knowledge of the sanctuaries, and then started to devise monitoring plans and research around the needs of the animals there.
It's a really interesting part of the world in the Gulf, because it's, between the better studied Cape York and the top end, but a lot of the things that you detected there had not been recorded.
That's right. It was a gap in knowledge, and we found out that actually for example, there is quite a connection of rainforest birds, for example, that come through this coastal scrub and little patches of rainforest through the Gulf. So yeah, we're still finding out stuff on that place actually.
So you were in that role for many years as regional ecologist in Queensland and the Northeast. But since 2014, you've been overseeing the entire national science program.
Yeah.
What was that transition like for you?
Super scary, and still is. It's such a vast responsibility. Luckily, we have a fantastic team. So we've got 60 ecologists, professional ecologists in the team. I've got great people like Liana, who's going to speak later on. And so really it is a team effort. I do remind myself of that because, my own knowledge, I'm not one of the people like Ari or Richard who are fantastic at catching wildlife. Wildlife catches me usually. And but I'm a generalist, and I'm passionately driven by connection to nature and conservation of nature. And I really want to combine that heart feeling with the head. That's what I'm driven to do, and AWC has been fantastic for me. It's been a non-stop journey intellectually. The people I've met, the supporters, our board have introduced me to different ways of thinking, and I love the fact that we've made a lot of progress in the work we do.
Yeah, I think, one of the distinguishing features of AWC's approach is that science is absolutely central. That's something that we pride ourselves on. And there was a lovely quote from David Attenborough talking about our work. He said, science, I'm not going to do the accent, science runs through the whole activities of AWC in a most admirable way. And it is essential that it should if it's going to succeed. And I think that's, really critical to the success of our work has been that foundation, very strong foundation in science. So you mentioned the team before. It's a high-powered and quite a large team of ecologists and scientists. Do you want to describe the structure of the team and how that works?
Sure. So, as I said, there's 60 full-time ecologists. 20 of them have PhDs, and we have an intern program with about a dozen interns a year. So, the sort of cream of the honours graduates in ecology, and volunteers and so on. So, structurally, we divide the country up into 5 regions, basically by region and a bit politically. So the Kimberley, for example, is a region, Queensland, NT, another. And then supporting that is the national science team that Liana, who we'll talk later, runs. So that's the structure. And we are, our mission, it's really quite interesting. It's unusual for this many ecologists. We're focused on providing information relevant to our conservation managers. So our land operations people, Sally and Graham, people like that. So we're not blue sky research, we're not like a uni. We do a mix of activities, which I'll describe in a second. Yeah, sorry, Joey, I've lost my train of thread there, but train of thought, but please ask me another question quickly.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, it's a high-powered and a really big team working in that regional structure. There's also a very active internship program. Do you want to just describe that and how that sort of becomes a bit of a pipeline for our ecologists? Yeah,
sure. So every year we advertise for those roles and, you know, get hundreds of applicants, generously supported by AWC supporters. And those ecologists spend time, you know, they go into those different regions and they become, you know, they get what they don't get at uni, which is a real grounding in field ecology. And of course, on the way, they have to fight a few fires or light a few fires, and they get to know what a conservation organisation is like. We get to know them as well. And to be honest, they're our main way we recruit into our junior level in the science team because they're just fantastic people. So, yeah, that's a great program.
I think maybe later on down the track, we could do a webinar with a bunch of interns or people who have come through the internship program.
Be great. Be great.
Yeah, we'll keep you posted on that. So you've got this enthusiastic, highly talented team spread out, many of them based on the sanctuaries and working together, as you say, with the land management and operations staff. So what does their work entail? What's their day-to-day work?
Sure. So at a high level, people like Liana and myself and the regional ecologists who manage each region, we give advice to our chief executive and you know, the board and so on about where we should be, you know, what opportunities are there for us to extend our mission. You know, we want to conserve potoroos or koalas. Where have we got to be? Once we have a property, then we've got quite a rigorous program. Thanks, Joey. That helps. So we do inventory. That's the sort of work I was describing on Pungalina 7 emu, where we get dropped off in helicopters and do fun stuff. Then there's the work that we're really going to do forever. Although, as you said earlier in this talk, we're always looking for ways of improving the efficiency of what we're doing. So that's the monitoring work. That's simply finding out, you know, year to year, how many bilbies, how many nail-tail wallabies, how many, you know, whatever's on our property. We do research, targeted research when things are going wrong or we want to fix them up. And we've done a bunch of that research. You know, we've got over 100, 150 research papers from our group. And from all that and people's existing knowledge, we feed into the land management strategy. So what's the science behind, what's the science say about an effective fire strategy or weed strategy? So that's sort of the guts of what we do. There is a special component of work the ecologists in AWC do, and that's reintroductions. We have by far the most ambitious reintroduction program in Australia. Very, very active, currently active at 3 sites. And we plan and implement and monitor that. And then, you know, we try to influence the conservation debate generally by publishing work, participating in workshops, that sort of thing.
I'll come back to influencing, you know, conservation more broadly, but I've got to show this photo of you with a bridled nail-tail wallaby.
That shows that I'm not really used to doing it. Look how I'm holding that poor animal. But that was when we were releasing nail-tails from one area at Scotia to another. So that's, you know, that fenced area at Scotia has, you know, more than half the remaining nail-tails in the world. Very, you know, effective in fenced areas, basically.
Yeah, so very, you know, critical to the survival of that species, really. All right, and you mentioned, you know, collaborating and influencing conservation more broadly. At this point, I might introduce Dr. Liana Joseph. So welcome, Liana.
Thank you,
Liana is
Joey.
AWC's National Science Manager, joining us from her home in northern New South Wales. Liana, have you got any good birds in the background there? Any wildlife in your house?
I'm in a little tower where I can't hear anything, but we often have blue-faced honeyeaters or white-cheeked honeyeaters around, and we get the winter migrants here at the moment, and there's some regent bowerbirds around at the moment, which are pretty spectacular.
Yeah, lovely. And Liana, you also have a huge amount of experience in conservation science, not just in Australia, but around the world. And I think we'll do a visual tour of your career with some photos. So do you want to describe where this one was taken?
Yeah, so in my early 20s, I spent a couple of years in Eastern Africa and Tanzania doing biodiversity surveys. And this is a giant millipede, which is an amazing critter that was fun to photograph with.
I can see we've had about 50 people just log off instantly at that photo. So everyone's freaked out. You've also looked at wildlife and human conflict in northern India, looking at snow leopards. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, that's right. That was one of my first postdoctoral experiences. I spent 6 months in India touring around the country looking at lots of different human-wildlife conflicts. This one's up in the northeast of the country, in Ladakh, and the traditional pastoralists there struggle with interacting with snow leopards who kill their goats. And yeah, they often try and reduce the numbers of snow leopards. At the moment, that people are supporting them to live with the snow leopards and get some money.
That's pretty fascinating work. I think we might have to do a whole separate webinar about that. And I think it's, what really strikes me is talking to everyone at AWC. We've got this fantastic collection of people with amazing backstories and lives, not just within the work they've done at AWC. Liana, as National Science Manager, you helped deliver the science program, and you've been really instrumental in designing our eco-health monitoring program, as well as research and land management strategies. And most recently, you've been working on something called the Threatened Species Index. Do you just want to describe what that is for people?
Yes, I will. So the Threatened Species Index is a number that can tell us about how threatened species are doing in Australia. So most people will be familiar with the economic indices that we have, like the Dow Jones. Well, we've never had anything like that for biodiversity. Recently, WWF UK and Zoological Society of London produced this index called the Living Planet Index, which is trying to tell us about how threatened species are doing around the world. So the NESP Threatened Species Recovery Hub, which is a group of researchers and conservation managers like us together and tried to work out a way that Australia can develop some indices to track our biodiversity. We, as a group, decided to adopt that Living Planet Index, and since 2016, the team has been building up data for a couple of indices. The Threatened Species Index for birds was released in 2016. Last year, the first Threatened Mammal Index was released, and this year they're updating the bird and the mammal indexes and also developing one for plants.
That's fantastic. It'd be nice to have an update on the news every night with the Threatened Species Index, but I think we're a way off that in the same way that we do for finance.
Yeah.
So AWC's contribution has been obviously the vast amount of data from our monitoring programs. Do you just want to talk for a little bit about how significant our contribution has been for this project?
Yes, so we were the major contributors of data to the Mammal Index last year. We contributed 18 data sets and that was for 9 threatened species across the country. This year we're going to contribute even more with an additional 14 data sets for another 6 species. Yeah, so it's a major contribution. It really demonstrates that we're producing or doing a lot of surveys across the country.
And just looking at that index at the moment, I know that that the Mammal Index in particular, which was the most recent to be published, it's already telling us something about different models of conservation. What does it tell us about AWC's model of conservation and especially the feral predator-free areas?
Yeah, well, you can see from the graph that Joey just put up that there's the two types of data that they've illustrated here. One is for sites that have no targeted management, it's the red line, and the blue line there is the data for species that are found within predator-free sites. This is for a period from around, well, sorry, it's different for different indexes, but for around 1995 to 2016, you see that in sites with no management, the populations of threatened species has gone down. It's by about 61%. And within feral predator-free sites, the number of populations have increased by over 500%. So it's pretty significant and shows that predator-free fences are really essential for the management of threatened mammals.
It's a really stark difference, and I think a very strong endorsement of that approach. So, you know, expanding the network of feral predator-free safe havens, which we know is critical for a whole bunch of threatened mammal species. But also the status quo is a story of decline. So for most threatened mammals, it's not looking good outside of those areas. So just a reminder now that you can ask questions using the Q&A button, and I can see a bunch of questions have already started to come in. I might start, well, we'll address some of those, and we've had lots and lots of questions actually. Some were sent in before today, so we'll get to as many as we can. For any questions that we can't address today, we'll get back to you and provide information afterwards. So anything that you're interested in to do with what we've been talking about, AWC's National Science Program, send us a question and we'll try and address it now. One of the questions that's been sent in is the impact of climate change. And John, I might get you to comment on how climate change is affecting our plans for implementing the science program and how that might affect things in the future.
Yeah, that's a big question, Joey. So, I mean, we've seen that with the bushfires this year, that we're getting an increase in extreme events that are pushing threshold changes in the environment. So, I mean, you know, when you look at graphs of increased temperature, it's all very smooth, you know, and you think, well, you know, we can cope with that. But actually what really happens that drives ecological change is extreme events. We had an extreme heat event in Newhaven this year coinciding with the trial release of numbats. And, you know, that was really hard for the numbats to reintroduce. So what we're going to have to do is look at projected climates into the future, how that intersects with our current conservation programs and what we can do about it. And it's actually quite a huge task, not just for AWC, but for conservation in Australia generally. So I know there is interest across the sector in this, and we've done a bit of a collaboration with other conservation organisations and academics around thinking how to scope it. But that's work that really is ahead of us. And so I guess watch this space. It's work that we will progress this year. It may lead us in different directions. So currently we acquire high conservation value land, but maybe in 50 years' time, the best place for a certain species is currently an agricultural area. So, you know, if that's the case, then we might be looking at buying or getting into partnerships or however getting into land that needs restoration, and then looking at 50 years down the track, that'll be good for nail-tail wallabies or koalas or whatever. Yeah,
so long-term planning, I guess, to help populations be resilient to those large-scale changes.
Yeah.
An interesting question here, just about the threatened species index that we were talking about. Is that publicly available, and where can people see that? Liana?
Yeah, there's a great website that NEF team have developed. Shall we put a link to that in the question?
Yeah, we can certainly do that. Yeah. And if we haven't got the link on hand, you can just type in threatened species index and NESP, and that should come up with the website to which AWC's contributed, and should show you the threatened mammal index.
And the other way to see that is on the Wildlife Matters article, Joey.
Oh yeah, good point. So for those of you who haven't yet received Wildlife Matters, it should be on its way, but I think most people should have got it by now. There's actually a really thorough article about this work written by John and Liana. So if you don't subscribe to the print edition, you can read that on our website. So that's Wildlife Matters. The website's australianwildlife.org. Another question here about reintroductions. And just before we take this one, I will let you know that next week, we're talking all about AWC's feral predator ecology research with Dr. Andrew Carter. So we'll have a quite extensive discussion about that next week. But this question today, are reintroductions beyond the fence more expensive in the long run than building a fence? John?
Well, Liana's going to answer this as well, but Liana, do you want to start? Because you're actually working on this at the moment.
Yeah, gosh, it's a hard question. So I am working on this at the moment with part of the NESP team. We're looking at doing a cost effectiveness analysis to examine exactly that question. What are the benefits for doing, you can take it if you want, I'm rambling a bit.
Well, I guess what I'd say is it's not just cost effectiveness, it's actually effectiveness. So in one sense, there's a bunch of species there's just no evidence at the moment they'll survive outside the fence with really any amount of feral cat or fox present. So if we want to save those species, we need to have the safe havens. You know, as an organisation, we're working very hard on outside the fence strategies, but you know, we don't want to be wishful thinking about it. And so yes, we'll look at the cost effectiveness of it. I suspect that in many cases it's going to be more cost effective to have a fenced area. But as an organisation, we aspire to have, you know, bilbies back in the landscape, Niltards back in the landscape. You know, they were the most common mammal in the Murray scrubs, you know, 150 years ago. So I guess it's a matter of, I don't know, you know, cost effectiveness is worth looking at, but at the end of the day, what do we want as a society? What's conservation about? It's more than drawing a line on a map. You know, AWC in particular is driven by effective conservation. That means not only, you know, protecting it from clearing, but making sure all the wildlife are back there doing the job that, you know, is part of evolutionary history.
Thank you. Another question about the Threatened Species Index and just about the funding for that work. So that's through, as you said, Liana, it's through the Threatened Species Recovery Hub, which is part of NESP, I think it's National Environmental Science Program.
That's right.
So how's that funded?
That's funded by the federal government, and Sally Box has been involved in supporting that NESP group.
Yep. So that's the Threatened Species Commissioner. So it's as I understand, it's a collection of research institutions, mostly universities, plus AWC, working together to solve pressing conservation issues to do with threatened species. Yep. Okay. Remember, you can still ask questions, so we've still got them coming in, and I'll just take another question now. Bear with me for a second. Okay, so this is a good one. Okay, so the focus for AWC tends to be on threatened mammals, says this person, but is there also work done on other threatened animals and plants? John, do you want to talk about why mammals tend to crop up as the focus of lots of our work?
Sure. So, I mean, broadly, our focus is on wildlife and the habitats that support them. So you just see a lot of work on mammals because in Australian wildlife, you know, we're a world leader. We're ahead of the pack in mammal extinctions. And so that is where we prioritise our work. And we've been a leading organisation in showing that, you know, the eradication of foxes and cats is a critical part of the conservation. When I went through uni, that was just simply not known. People would say, oh, it's rabbits, climate change, it's whatever, you know, but actually we've shown, and this is now very well established, that feral cats and fox, this is a primary driver of mammal extinctions. We can do something about it. We've had a lot of success there, but absolutely we work across the board. And I mean, if you look at that Wildlife Matters, Joey, that you called out before, you'll see articles on snakes, birds, plants. You know, we have specialist botanists we employ. We've got crazy bat people, crazy hurt people, crazy frog people. Yeah, and, you know, we're interested in conserving it all. It's just that the mammals at the moment and for the foreseeable future just require special attention.
Another one, a quick one here, John, for you. We talked about the mission being to protect or effectively conserve all Australian wildlife or animal species. How are we going towards that mission? Because that's, you know, that sets a very clear target. We want to have representation of all vertebrate groups. Yeah.
So, I mean, we have, and you probably know these numbers better than me, Joey, but, you know, we keep track very close track of which species we have represented, and particularly which threatened species we have. And then we evaluate in terms of, as I said, we advise where we should acquire property or have partnerships. We look at species that aren't being effectively conserved, and is anybody doing anything about them? And can we add value? So, for example, there's a list come out a couple of years ago, the 20 Australian birds and mammals most likely to go extinct in the next 20 years. We're looking at that list and seeing, so things like the mammal the most likely to go extinct was a thing called the central rock rat. If you're into native rodents, which I am, it's just a beautiful, chunky guinea pig type animal that lives in a few ranges around Alice Springs. It's absolutely not in any safe area at the moment. Our New Haven project has been partly designed to provide habitat for that species. And in fact, we've got a long list for all those species that are considered threatened by cats and foxes. Where would we need to be and what projects would we need to do to conserve them? Another example is the northern bettong. It's also on that list. It's got 2 populations left. It's in the country that I live in, and it's in terrible trouble, less than 1,000 animals, and we are about to build a fence area for it at Mount Zero Taravale, down near Townsville, and do a reintroduction. So, yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, so absolutely prioritised to the species which have the most need. In terms of representation of wildlife species in total, currently we protect around 72% of land mammals, nearly 90% of terrestrial birds, and over half of Australia's reptile and amphibian species.
Thanks,
so that's, that sort of defines also, I guess, where our future projects might be. It tells us what's not protected and where we need to be working to increase that representation. Okay, another question here about the long-term future for our fenced areas. So, managing these feral predator-free fences is, as we've said, critical for having bilbies and bettongs around in the very short term. In the long term, is there an objective to remove those fences?
That would be a lovely day, but we'd only do it when we knew that we could effectively conserve things like bettongs or nail-tail wallabies or bilbies outside the fence. So, in actual fact, we're about to do 2 releases outside the fence at our Mount Gibson project in southwest WA next year. And the feral predator work that Andrew Carter will talk about next week is all about informing us how effective are the control technology we use, baiting and so on, and what's the risk, and once we do a reintroduction, you really need to have a really good handle on the predator density, so that if it fails, you've got a handle on why it failed. And, AWC and other organisations who have fenced areas have done reintroductions outside fences in the past without sufficient knowledge of predator density, and you can't really interpret the outcome when it doesn't work. So we are moving that way. I guess the other thing is the blue sky silver bullet type approach with gene drives that I think some of you might know about. Some collaboration we've been discussing with CSIRO and other groups about developing sort of modern technological approaches to feral cat control at a continental scale, 10, 20 years off. If that worked, then absolutely, let's rip the fences out and let's all have a bilby in the backyard.
That'd be a very good day, as you say. Okay, another question here about, with the reintroduction projects again, the effect that has on extant species, so mammals, plants, fungus, and that's something that we've looked at specifically, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. So got a paper that just come out looking at the benefit of the fence for extant mammals at Scotia. So the mammals are already there. There's, a lot of mammals have become extinct from cats and foxes, but you do get some little ones hanging on, and some of them are threatened. So Bolam's mouse is an example, and some little dasyurids, little carnivorous marsupials, they've increased inside the fenced area. We know that mallee fowl, which breed on the ground and are attacked by foxes, their breeding success is better in the fenced area. And we're just our botanists have been going around the country doing really intensive measuring of the response of plants and vegetation to the reintroductions as well. And that first paper is actually sitting with me at the moment, waiting to do the final polishing before we submit that. So yeah, it's something that's really interesting, and the effects go right through you know, the reintroductions of the bilbies eat, you know, I think they eat the scorpions, and the scorpions, there's less scorpions, so there's more spiders, and there's less, the termites go down deeper in the ground, there's less decomposition at the top. The leaf litter gets buried by the digging animals, and that lowers the fire risk a bit, changes the rate of soil and water turnover. That's what I say about conservation, is getting these animals back in the landscape, because they all do stuff. They've been part of this country for, you know, millions and millions of years. They've been gone for 100. People forget that, you know, we haven't, it's not in our lifetime, right? But you go to Central Australia, and the Indigenous people of that area, they know full well that they've just lost a bilby from that area or whatever. Those animals are culturally important for them, and they're keen for us to bring them back in. What I would love is, you know, people on this conference, and Australians generally, to be calling for their governments, bring us back our bilbies. You know, at the moment we have to jump through as many hoops as a developer does to do a reintroduction project, because it's viewed as a disturbance. You know, it's crazy. So yeah, shake the can, people.
Sounds good. Thank you, John. A fiery speech there. It's inspiring. We've had more questions about the internship program, which is incredibly popular. And I'll just let people know that there's been a link posted in the chat. So if you're interested, you can read up on our internship program there. There's also more information on our website. And there's a volunteer portal too. So if volunteering is your way in to do some of this sort of work, you can sign up at our volunteer portal and get more information about the internship program online. Okay, we've got one more question here about introduced species which are not predators. So I guess cane toads are one that we talk about quite a lot. Do you want to talk about our current work with cane toads just briefly, John?
Yeah, sure. So we've had a long-running research program collaborating with academics in the Kimberley, essentially trying to teach quolls. So northern quolls are the major predator up in the north, that cane toads will kill them. And we're doing that by essentially introducing a taste aversion with the toad meat. It works very well in the lab, but we've actually just had a crew up in the Artesian Range this wet season, when we're unfortunately not having much luck with it in the wild. I'm waiting for the report from that research group in the Kimberley before we decide what to do next. I mean, it may be something you just have to tweak something. How do you make toad sausages taste better, Joey? A bit of marjoram or something.
That's a cooking challenge.
That's right. That's a different webinar.
Yeah, change the recipe.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. It's really interesting work, and I think we'll pretty likely do a session on that too at some point. It's really interesting. Yeah. I just thought too, but we've talked about some of that research with feral predators and with cane toads just now, but a lot of the research is also looking at specific ecology of threatened species. So trying to find out what threatening processes are and how we might be able to deal with them. Do you want to just name a few of those really interesting threatened species research projects?
Well, do you have that slide of the Shaman's rock wallaby? Is that possible to pull up?
I don't have it on me, I'm afraid.
Okay, no, that's okay. So one of our ecologists, Kath Hayes in the Northeast, her PhD on Mount Zero Taravale was on Shaman's rock wallaby, a beautiful rock wallaby that's really just restricted to Mount Zero and a few neighbouring properties. She looked at its ecology and its response to burning. So that was done in close collaboration with our manager at the time, Tim White. And she also looked at potential climate change impacts. And, the worrying thing about her models was that the climate envelope that species currently exists within will not be there in 50 years' time under current climate scenarios. So whether that's important or not, we don't know, but there's a bunch of research when we talk about climate change. The fundamental ecology of Australian mammals and Australian wildlife is just so poorly known. We're still struggling to figure out where species are. So yeah, thank you, Joey. That's it. So this is from Kath's PhD, and those maps down in the bottom show the range of this species. Mount Zero is the dotted line there, and basically show that the predicted habitat for it, defined by temperature, basically vanishes in the future under various emission scenarios. So there's that sort of work done. Joey, we could talk about your work on black grass wren, you know, up in the Kimberley. So, you know, that's not a mammal. That's a bird that acts like a mammal, scurrying around like a mouse. We'll get you to talk about that one time.
Yeah, maybe one time.
I'll interview you. I'll interview you.
All right, let's do that. So that, yeah, I guess that was looking at fire regimes in particular, and whether the grass wrens were showed a tendency to occur in areas subject to different fire regimes, and how that interacted with habitat metrics as well. Yeah, we can talk about that another time, I reckon.
Yeah, and that ties in with all that work in the Kimberley on fire and destocking and mammals and birds. So there's a huge amount of research coming out of the Kimberley at the moment on that issue.
Might just take one more question before we leave it for today. So it's a question about decision making and how we coordinate with other conservation organisations. To what extent is AWC's decision making with respect to reintroductions coordinated with other organisations and government agencies?
Well, it is coordinated in that we need to work with a range of groups to obtain the animals and then to get approvals. There is an extent to which we've got our own program, and you know, if we had another 2 hours, I could talk about it in depth. But we've got another 30 or so reintroductions planned in the next, 5 years. That's our work to do. We develop the plans. As we're doing that, we're talking to the relevant stakeholders. And, for example, arid recovery, another fenced area, just one site in South Australia, we provided them with animals from our places before, and we're hoping to get some animals from them. So there's quite a lot of collaboration. It is a very collaborative space. And AWC, we have a vast amount of collaboration across all of our science program. I mean, it's how science works, right? Liana, did you have something to say to that? Because you're a better collaborator than me.
Well, I was going to use an example that literally this morning I had a phone call with the Bilby Recovery Team's Metapopulation Subcommittee. And as a team, we're working on how to make that the Bilby metapopulation as genetically diverse as possible. So that involves us all working together to move animals around the country in the best way possible.
Yeah, and obviously dealing with those small populations or relic populations, there's discussions of genetic mixing and making sure you get a good representation in founder populations for reintroductions. Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time, but that was a really interesting discussion. I think we could talk to each of you for another half an hour easily, so we'll get you back on at some point. Thank you, John, very much for tuning in from North Queensland.
Pleasure, Joey. Thanks, mate. Much appreciated.
And thanks, Liana, from Northern New South Wales.
It was a pleasure, Joey. Thank you very much.
To all of our guests who have tuned in, thank you for your support, because remember, all of this work is not possible without you. Our science program is a critical part of AWC's work, and our ecologists around Australia are really grateful that you're enabling their work to go on. If you're inspired by what we've been talking about and you'd like to make a donation, especially before the end of financial year, please get in touch with one of us at AWC, or you can donate on our website at australianwildlife.org. And the link for that donation page is in the chat now, so you can click on that in the chat at the bottom. As I mentioned earlier, our magazine is out, Wildlife Matters, and you can read more about the Threatened Species Index in there, as well as all of our other work around the country. And there's a link to the magazine in the chat as well. I hope you'll join me next week. It's more science. So we're joined by Dr. Andrew Carter, and he'll be talking about our feral predator ecology work, looking at foxes and cats outside of fenced areas and how we might be able to reduce their densities. So making progress beyond the fence as well. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you next week.